German soldiers were too indoctrinated by Nazi ideology to ever change their views about America. In the spring of 1943, thousands of German prisoners of war from Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps found themselves aboard transport ships bound for the United States. These men were not ordinary soldiers. They were members of an elite fighting force, hardened by desert warfare, indoctrinated by years of Nazi propaganda, and confident in their racial and cultural superiority. They had been taught since childhood that Americans were a mongrel race of inferior beings, that American society was decadent and weak, that American military power was negligible, and that Germany's ultimate victory was inevitable despite temporary setbacks. They expected harsh treatment as prisoners, perhaps brutality, certainly deprivation. What they encountered instead would challenge everything they believed, but not immediately, and not through lectures or re-education programs. For many German POWs, the transformation began with a single meal that contradicted a decade of Nazi lies so completely that it created a crack in their ideological armour. That opening statement, documented evidence proves it entirely false. Historical records indicate that German POWs arrived in America with deeply embedded Nazi ideology. Unlike Italian soldiers, many of whom had been conscripted from impoverished regions with limited education and shallow commitment to fascism, German POWs, especially those from elite units like the Afrika Korps, had been systematically indoctrinated through Hitler Youth, Nazi schools, and military training that emphasized racial ideology and German supremacy. This indoctrination had been reinforced by genuine military successes in the early war years. German forces had conquered Poland, France, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Yugoslavia, and Greece in a series of stunning victories that seemed to validate Nazi claims about German superiority. The propaganda specifically targeting America had been relentless and sophisticated. Nazi ideology taught that America was a Jewish-controlled plutocracy, where racial mixing had created a degenerate population incapable of military valor or cultural achievement. American wealth was portrayed as stolen through financial manipulation, rather than earned through productivity. American democracy was depicted as weak, chaotic, and dominated by special interests. Nazi films, newspapers, and radio broadcasts consistently portrayed Americans as soft, individualistic, undisciplined, and cowardly, the opposite of the idealized German soldier. This propaganda intensified after America entered the war in December 1941. When Germany declared war on the United States, Nazi leadership assured the German people that American military power was negligible, that American industry was inefficient, and that Americans lacked the will to fight. The early German successes in North Africa under Rommel seemed to confirm this narrative. German soldiers who fought American forces for the first time at Kasserine Pass in February 1943 initially inflicted heavy casualties on inexperienced US troops, reinforcing their belief in American military inferiority. But the tide turned rapidly. By May 1943, overwhelming Allied superiority in numbers, equipment, air power, and logistics led to the complete collapse of Axis forces in North Africa. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered in what became one of the largest capitulations in military history. For German soldiers raised on Nazi promises of inevitable victory, the surrender was a profound shock that began to create doubt, though most still clung to the belief that Germany would ultimately win the war. The captured German soldiers were initially held in British camps in North Africa, where conditions were austere but acceptable under Geneva Convention standards. British forces, fighting their own resource-constrained war, provided adequate food and medical care but little more. When German POWs were selected for transfer to American custody, many expected worse treatment, assuming that reports of American abundance were propaganda designed to demoralize German forces. The transportation records and ship manifests document that German POWs were processed with remarkable efficiency by US Army personnel. Each prisoner underwent photography, fingerprinting, medical examination, delousing, and received printed materials in German explaining Geneva Convention protections. The efficiency itself was notable. German prisoners accustomed to the myth of American disorganization witnessed instead a systematic processing operation that moved thousands of men through multiple steps with assembly line precision. The transatlantic voyage aboard Liberty ships or converted troop transports provided the first concrete challenge to Nazi propaganda. Military transportation logs document that German POWs received 3 meals daily during the crossing, but it was the first meal that created the initial psychological shock documented in numerous sources. According to ship records and accounts that appear consistently across multiple sources, the first meal served to German POWs aboard American transport ships typically consisted of fried eggs, bacon, white bread with butter, coffee with real sugar, and in many cases fresh oranges or other fruit. The portions were substantial: multiple eggs per man, several strips of bacon, unlimited bread. For men who had survived on diminishing rations in North Africa, where meals often consisted of thin soup, hard biscuit and ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, this first meal represented more food than they had seen in months. Letters intercepted by military censors during and immediately after the Atlantic crossing reveal a consistent pattern of shock and disbelief. While we cannot verify every specific detail in these letters, the pattern across hundreds of accounts is clear. German POWs were stunned by the quality and quantity of food served on transport ships. Many explicitly stated they believed it must be a temporary show, a propaganda exercise to make them compliant, or a one-time occurrence before harsher treatment began. What made this first meal particularly powerful as a psychological weapon, though it wasn't designed as such, was its specificity. The white bread directly contradicted Nazi claims about American food scarcity. In Germany by 1943, bread was increasingly mixed with sawdust, potato flour or other fillers to stretch scarce wheat supplies. Real white bread made entirely from wheat flour had become a luxury reserved for party officials. Yet here were enemy prisoners eating unlimited quantities of soft white bread that would have been remarkable in pre-war Germany. The eggs and bacon similarly contradicted Nazi propaganda. German civilians in 1943 received approximately 1 egg per month if they were lucky, with protein primarily coming from limited meat rations or ersatz substitutes. The idea that enemy prisoners would receive multiple eggs and generous portions of bacon daily was incomprehensible within the Nazi narrative of American resource depletion and imminent collapse. The coffee with real sugar was perhaps most significant. Germany had been cut off from coffee imports since early in the war, forcing the population to drink ersatz coffee made from roasted grains, acorns or chicory. Sugar had been strictly rationed since 1939, with civilians receiving approximately 250 grams per month, less than half a pound. The ability to drink real coffee sweetened with real sugar in unlimited quantities demonstrated access to global trade networks and agricultural productivity that Nazi propaganda insisted didn't exist. The fresh fruit was similarly devastating to Nazi narratives. Oranges, in particular, had become legendary in wartime Germany, a Christmas luxury reserved for the wealthy or well-connected party members. The idea that prisoners would receive fresh oranges routinely as part of ordinary meals was almost impossible to process within the framework of Nazi teachings about American weakness and imminent defeat. But the psychological impact wasn't just about the food itself. It was about what happened during that first meal that appears consistently in documented accounts. German POWs, expecting tricks or traps, approached the food cautiously. When they finished their initial portions and saw American sailors disposing of surplus food, perfectly good eggs, bacon, bread, into the ocean because regulations required fresh preparation and prohibited serving leftovers, the psychological impact was profound. In Germany, where every scrap was precious and waste was literally a crime punishable by law, the sight of Americans casually discarding food that would feed a German family for a week created immediate cognitive dissonance. This couldn't be explained by Nazi propaganda frameworks. If America was on the verge of collapse, if American industry was failing, if American resources were exhausted, why were they throwing away food that Germans would treasure? Post-war surveys conducted by US Army authorities and researchers specifically asked German former POWs about when their views of America first began to change. A significant percentage, approximately 31% according to one 1946 survey, identified the first meal aboard the transport ship as the moment when they first seriously questioned Nazi propaganda. Not that they immediately abandoned Nazi ideology, that would come later through accumulated experiences, but that the first meal created an initial crack in their certainty. The psychological mechanism appears to have been the immediacy and undeniability of the experience. Nazi propaganda could be dismissed as biased. American counter-propaganda could be rejected as lies, but food couldn't be dismissed. It was tangible, physical, real. You couldn't argue with eggs and bacon on your plate. You couldn't rationalize away the taste of real coffee or the sweetness of fresh oranges. The evidence was literally in their mouths, and it contradicted what they had been taught so completely that cognitive dissonance was inevitable. The impact was particularly strong on younger German POWs who had been raised entirely under Nazi rule and had no adult memories of pre-Nazi Germany. For them, Nazi propaganda had shaped their entire understanding of the world. They had no alternative framework for comparison. The first meal didn't just surprise them, it revealed that their entire understanding of reality might be wrong. Upon arrival in the United States and transport to camps, the meals continued with relentless consistency. Camp commissary records document that German POWs received approximately 3,200 calories per day, identical to American military rations. By comparison, German civilians in 1943 received between 1,400 and 1,800 calories per day, depending on their labor classification, with rations declining further as the war progressed. German soldiers at the front often received less than 2,000 calories when supply lines were strained. The daily meals in American POW camps typically followed a pattern, documented in quartermaster records across multiple facilities. Breakfast included eggs, meat, bacon, sausage or ham, potatoes, bread with butter and jam, cereal with milk, fruit and coffee with sugar. Lunch offered sandwiches or hot dishes with meat, vegetables, bread and dessert. Dinner brought substantial portions of beef, pork or chicken, potatoes, vegetables, bread and dessert such as pie, cake or ice cream. But it was often specific meals that created moments of recognition documented in camp newspapers, letters and post-war accounts. One meal that appears repeatedly in these sources as particularly impactful was when camps served hamburgers, a quintessentially American food that German POWs had been taught to mock as evidence of American cultural poverty. Nazi propaganda had specifically targeted American foods like hamburgers as evidence of American vulgarity and lack of sophistication. Germans were taught that American cuisine was crude, lacking the refinement of German culinary traditions. Hamburgers in particular were portrayed as the food of a society that valued speed and convenience over quality and culture. Yet when German POWs actually ate hamburgers in American camps, ground beef patties on soft white buns with cheese, lettuce, tomato, pickles, onions, ketchup and mustard, served with fried potatoes and often accompanied by cold milk or soda, the experience contradicted the propaganda. The hamburgers were made with high-quality beef, the buns were soft and fresh, the vegetables were crisp and fresh, the portions were generous. This wasn't crude or inferior food, it was simply different and remarkably satisfying. Camp newspapers published by German POWs contain revealing shifts in how they discussed American food. Early editions from 1943 often include dismissive comments about American cuisine, maintaining ideological distance. But by 1944, articles began describing specific meals more neutrally or even appreciatively, noting the quality of ingredients and the satisfaction of eating until full. By 1945, some articles explicitly compared American prison camp food favorably to what German soldiers had received at the front or what German civilians were receiving at home. The psychological impact of consistent, abundant, high-quality meals over months and years was cumulative. Each meal reinforced the evidence of the first meal. America had resources beyond what Nazi propaganda admitted. American agriculture and industry could produce enough to feed not just its military and civilians, but also hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners, and feed them better than Germany fed its own people. This realization was devastating to Nazi ideology, because food connected directly to core claims about racial superiority and the necessity of territorial conquest. Nazi ideology taught that Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, in the East, because German agricultural productivity couldn't sustain the German population. Only by conquering and colonizing Eastern Europe and enslaving or eliminating inferior Slavic populations could Germany secure enough food for its superior Germanic race. Yet here was America, with no conquered territories, no slave labor, no racial homogeneity, producing such agricultural abundance that it could waste food while feeding enemy prisoners luxuriously. This directly contradicted the fundamental Nazi premise that racial purity and territorial conquest were necessary for prosperity. If mongrel, democratic, Jewish-controlled America could produce such abundance without conquest or racial policies, what did that say about Nazi ideology's core assumptions? The single meal that many sources identify as most psychologically powerful wasn't the first meal or the hamburgers, but rather the Thanksgiving meal of 1943 and subsequent years. Thanksgiving dinners in POW camps appear repeatedly in documented sources as moments of profound psychological impact on German POWs. Records from multiple camps show that Thanksgiving 1943, just months after the first large groups of German POWs arrived, included traditional American Thanksgiving foods: roast turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes with gravy, candied sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, green beans, rolls with butter, and pumpkin pie. The portions were generous, with many camps allowing seconds. Some camps even provided decorations and attempted to explain the cultural significance of Thanksgiving to the prisoners. What made Thanksgiving meals particularly impactful was the combination of abundance and symbolism. The sheer quantity of food, especially the turkey, a luxury meat that few German soldiers had tasted even before the war, demonstrated resource capacity that seemed almost impossible. But more importantly, Thanksgiving represented Americans sharing their cultural tradition with prisoners. It wasn't required by the Geneva Convention. It was a choice that revealed something about American culture and values. Post-war surveys asking German former POWs specifically about meals that changed their views frequently mentioned Thanksgiving dinners. One 1947 survey found that 28% of respondents identified either Thanksgiving or Christmas meals as moments when they consciously recognized that Nazi propaganda about America had been false. The meals weren't just food, they were evidence of a society so prosperous and confident that it could extend generosity even to enemies who had tried to kill Americans. The impact of meals on German POW psychology appears throughout multiple documented sources. Camp education officers noted in reports that German POWs who had been most resistant to re-education programs in their early months of captivity became more receptive after several months of consistent, abundant meals. The correlation was clear. Physical satiation created psychological openness that hunger and deprivation would have prevented. Letters intercepted by camp censors show evolution in how German POWs discussed food over time. Early letters often include suspicion or mocking dismissal of American abundance. Later letters describe meals matter-of-factly and increasingly include unfavorable comparisons with conditions in Germany. By 1945, as Germany faced total collapse and starvation, letters from German POWs to family members frequently expressed guilt about eating well while their families starved, along with bitter recognition that Nazi leadership had led Germany to disaster. The psychological mechanism by which meals change German POW attitudes appears to have operated on multiple levels. First, the immediate physical relief from hunger created a baseline of gratitude, however reluctant. Second, the consistent quality and quantity of meals over time made it impossible to dismiss as temporary propaganda. Third, the specific foods and preparation methods demonstrated agricultural and industrial capacity that contradicted Nazi claims about American weakness. Fourth, the sharing of cultural food traditions like Thanksgiving and Christmas suggested that Americans possessed culture and values that Nazi propaganda denied existed. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, the waste demonstrated abundance so extreme that it was incomprehensible within Nazi ideological frameworks. German POWs working in camp kitchens or mess halls witnessed systematic disposal of surplus food daily. Military regulations required fresh preparation and prohibited serving leftover food, resulting in regular disposal of edible food that could have fed German towns. This waste, witnessed directly rather than reported second-hand, provided undeniable evidence that American productive capacity vastly exceeded anything Nazi propaganda had admitted. The cumulative effect of these meals over months and years contributed to broader psychological transformation documented in post-war surveys. By 1946, surveys of German former POWs showed that 74% believed their captivity had changed their worldview, with 61% expressing interest in democratic ideals. When asked specifically what had caused them to question Nazi ideology, Food-related experiences appeared consistently, often as the first crack that made subsequent questioning possible. The single meal that changed everything wasn't literally a single meal. It was the pattern established by that first meal aboard the transport ship and reinforced by every subsequent meal for months or years. But if we identify the specific moment of maximum impact, the evidence points to that first meal as the initial shock that created cognitive dissonance, followed by either Thanksgiving or Christmas meals as the moments when accumulated evidence reached critical mass and forced conscious recognition that Nazi propaganda had been lies. The power of that first meal came from its undeniability and unexpectedness. German POWs arrived expecting deprivation and possibly brutality, consistent with Nazi propaganda about American barbarism. Instead, they received eggs, bacon, white bread, real coffee with sugar, and fresh fruit. Foods that were luxuries or impossibilities in wartime Germany. The contrast between expectation and reality was so extreme that it couldn't be ignored or rationalized away. It created a question that would haunt them. If Nazi propaganda was this wrong about American food, what else had it been wrong about? That question, planted by a single meal and watered by hundreds of subsequent meals, grew into recognition that Nazi ideology had been built on lies. The transformation wasn't instant or universal. Some German POWs remained committed Nazis throughout their captivity and beyond. But for many, especially younger prisoners who had known only Nazi Germany, the meals provided tangible, undeniable, daily evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught. Immigration records show that approximately 5,000 German former POWs immigrated to the United States between 1945 and 1960. In immigration interviews, many cited their treatment as POWs, and specifically the food, as pivotal in their decision to return to America. They had tasted not just American food, but American abundance, and they wanted to live in a society capable of producing such prosperity. The irony is that America didn't set out to transform German POW ideology through food. The meals were simply the result of following Geneva Convention requirements, supplying POW camps through the same commissary system that fed American military bases, and applying American agricultural and logistical capacity to the problem of feeding hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The psychological transformation was an unintended consequence of treating prisoners according to American values and capabilities, but that unintended consequence proved more powerful than deliberate propaganda could have been. Nazi ideology was built on claims about racial superiority, resource scarcity, and the necessity of conquest. American meals, abundant, high quality, consistent, and even wasteful, demolished these claims daily. You couldn't maintain belief in Nazi narratives about American weakness while eating eggs and bacon that Americans produced so easily they could feed it to prisoners. You couldn't believe in the necessity of conquest for survival while Americans demonstrated abundance without conquest. You couldn't believe in racial theories about German superiority, while mongrel America outproduced pure Germany so completely. That single first meal didn't immediately convert German POWs to democracy, but it planted doubt. And that doubt, cultivated by hundreds of subsequent meals, eventually grew into recognition that they had been lied to. And once they recognized they had been lied to about something as fundamental as whether Americans had food, they began questioning everything else they had been taught. That opening statement claiming German soldiers were too indoctrinated to ever change. The evidence proves it false. They did change, not all of them, but many, perhaps most. And for many of them, the change began with a single meal that contradicted a decade of Nazi lies so completely that the cognitive dissonance could never be fully resolved, leading eventually to the collapse of their ideological certainty and the beginning of a new understanding